We need to look at security in two fronts. One, physical security, and probably economic security. The nature of threat in Africa today, it will be so unlikely that foot soldiers from another continent come to beat up a country, a state in Africa. Of course, having the foot soldiers is important, well trained for that matter. But besides that, we really need to invest on issues, technology. I don't think you can be secure by bringing another person to your home when you know very well that you don't know the motives of this person. So my name is Dr. Onyango, holder of PhD in International Relations and Diplomacy. I teach, I am a lecturer at Kenyatta University. My areas of research, basically, I'm keen in issues African affairs, issues international security, humanitarian assistance, peace and conflict. I teach both undergraduate, masters and PhD at the university. I also do research and consultancy in the fields of international relations and diplomacy. Diplomacy is as important as the way people relate, also states relate, and diplomacy is now the means of how countries relate to each other in the international system. So basically, Kenya and Uganda, or Kenya and America, or Kenya and any other country, the official communication channel for them is diplomacy. And in this diplomacy, there are specific areas that a country focus on as they advance their interest. And they could be economic diplomacy, where countries advance their interest economically. It could be cultural diplomacy, or basically political diplomacy. Of course, there are many other brands of diplomacy that have come up as the world changes and as the international environment changes. Diplomacy is the means of state communicating to other states. Every other state, their national interest is coined into their foreign policy objectives. And for us, Kenya, we have had foreign policy that is just new after the revision of the 2014 foreign policy that was documented. So recently, last year or early this year, we commissioned a new foreign policy that now guides our operation. But basically, our broad goals of the Kenyan foreign policy is to promote and protect our interests both regionally and globally. And those interests are varied from economics, from security, to environmental diplomacy, to cultural diplomacy. So these are goals that Kenya is trying to advance to the rest of the world as we enhance our sovereignty and national development. Within the international environment, of course, every other state tries to advance their interest. And when they advance their interest, differences are bound to occur. One of the interests of Kenya, as I give an example, is protecting their sovereignty, territorial sovereignty. And you realize that there are isolated examples. For example, the Migingo issue, where Kenya and Uganda had a boundary issue over Migingo. Of course, they used diplomatic channels to try and resolve that conflict It is not fully resolved, but at least it has, the noise has gone down. There are still some instances of Kenyan fishermen complaining that Uganda military is bringing some disturbance to them, but overall they resolved it in a diplomatic way, in that they set up joint ministerial committees to look at the issue. Issues of diplomacy, issues of international issues, these are real politics, in that you look at cost-benefit analysis. Of course, we have categorically stated the position of Kenya has stated its position as regards to the question of that region. But then again, at the time that the issue was on, you could look at the trade volume. We were gaining more in terms of trade with Uganda because they were the largest traders that we had at the time. And therefore, I assume that the Kenyan authorities did not want to push them so hard, considering what we are benefiting economically at the time. I am sure if that issue re-emerges today, the reaction would be different, because it appears in terms of trade, we've been losing influence from Uganda. Tanzania has been really taking advantage of the Ugandan market more than Kenya. And therefore, at the time, I think it was convenient to behave the way they did. But given the circumstances today and the Kenya's position, I think the management of that issue can be different. Generally in Africa, the colonial boundaries as were established is the problem. Because you realize these boundaries were established, but communities separated. You find communities in Kenya and communities in other parts of that borders Kenya, same communities, only separated with a colonial boundary. That is the issue that is befalling most African states, and therefore making the question of the boundary so hard to manage. And that is also what is befalling that area, so that because of the cultural connections, people seem to realize that there is no real what I can call barrier in terms of states. They operate freely. Yet different states, Kenya and countries around there, Ethiopia, Sudan, they really want to bring a clear cut that Kenya ends here, Somali ends here, Sudan ends here, Ethiopia ends here. And also, of course, the boundaries in that region have been moved. If you look at our 1960s map of Kenya, that section, the triangle, is not there. The triangle was later reclaimed and given to Kenya. And that one, I think, the other country has never reconciled with it. And therefore, it brings still issues. You can coincide that one with Kenya-Somali boundary, whereby, of course, a larger part of what was called Northern Frontier was claimed by Somali. And therefore, the question of boundary in that region, the triangle, the Kenya-Somali boundary, is really problematic, simply because of the cultural connections. People operate freely, and you can never realize that you are in another country, because the culture is the same, the language is the same, the practices are the same. And therefore, when a government comes and now try to bring restrictions, when some of the relatives are on the other side, it brings problem. So these are the issues that bring problems within the boundaries, not only in that region, but even these other parts of Kenya that share borders with the East African countries.
Issue around the Elemi Triangle appears to be very well managed, because we have never really fought a war the three countries, Kenya, Ethiopia, Sudan, have never fought a war around that particular boundary. So what account for the success or for the peace that prevails in that region, given all these different claims by different countries?
Yes, of course, I think this is one of the regions that the agreements or treaties that have been signed is really working, because there are treaties that have been signed with tripartite treaties, bilateral treaties concerning management of the borders, and this is one unique case where the treaties are working. So largely we can attribute the relatively peace there. I'm saying relatively cautiously because countries have not fought, but there's a lot of disquiet around that area. So of course it's only a matter of time. If dynamics change, then we will realize that it can erupt.
The Somali question, we have been wrangling with Somalia over the maritime boundary, and also up north. You said earlier that there is the issue of the claims that are often made by Somalia on a large territory of Kenya, and the whole issue of irredentism. So maybe you could update our viewers on that issue, including the genesis of it.
The Somali question is very, very dynamic, with different interests, not only regionally but globally. So start with the question of the marine boundary. You will realize that generally foreign interests are keen on getting the wealth that is beneath the water, the oil reserves, and therefore they find it easier to deal with Somali than to deal with Kenya in terms of exploring the natural resources down there. And because Somali is not relatively stable, it is easy to get into them than coming to deal with the Kenyan authorities. And therefore, it is easy to push Somali behind the scenes to claim that territory, other than dealing with Kenya claiming that territory. And therefore, that question of the boundary is purely driven by foreign interest. Somali itself is just a vehicle that is being used. But besides that, of course, the problems in Somali started way back during the collapse of the dictatorship in the 1990s. And of course, everybody knows about the conflict, clanism there. At some point, there was the courts running the Somali states, and therefore the conflict in there at some point has taken a toll into the neighboring countries, of course forcing us, Kenya, to go to Somali, of course to secure Kenya's interests, because at the time Somalia was being used as the base for Al-Shabaab to attack Kenya, and therefore Kenya decided to go there. Today, even after Kenya establishing a transition government, of course facilitated a transition government and that was established here in Kenya, Somali now feels that Kenya has overstayed their mandate, and therefore that is the disquiet that is there. Some of the feelings in Somali is that Kenya has really overstayed their welcome, and therefore they're trying to tell them, now we are a sovereign state, keep off. And for Kenyan interest, of course, security is key. They don't want to keep off. Instead, they have transformed into other formations like AMISOM and making their troops put still in Somali to make sure that their interests are secured. Basically, we can simply argue that in Africa, the guns have not stopped. In African affairs, people talking about silencing the guns. But as it's the state today, the guns have not stopped. Maybe we can say that the guns have changed in terms of who they are shooting. Earlier on, remember, we got African states got their independence, and issues of nationalism were so key. Issues of territorial sovereignty was key in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. Issues of sovereignty led to now conflicts, and this conflict largely were conflict between states. You remember conflict between Uganda and Kenya. Uganda, Tanzania. It was generally conflict between one state and another over issues sovereignty, and that one really marked the larger part of the 60s, the 70s, and the 80s. But you realize that these conflicts shifted from between states to now interstate conflicts. And these interstate conflicts are now the problem up to today. So you can see the shift from two countries to now interstates, factions within states fighting. And there are so many examples to highlight. Of course, most importantly, the Congo crisis that has even today still raging on. Many actors have come in to try and resolve, but not yet. We can also point out the Rwanda genocide. This is just within state. Of course, the Horn of Africa, Somali, has had its shares of conflict. Ethiopia, even us Kenya here, 2007, we had our share of conflict. So conflict have just transformed, and they have transformed because actors within Africa have also evolved. There are factions that maybe feel aggrieved. There are factions that are funded from outside, and those ones are meant to either destabilize the state or they are keen to overthrow the state. But by and large, some of these conflicts are attributed to governance issues. Governance issues, all of us know, revolves around issues, allocation of resources, issues, people feeling that they don't belong or they don't belong enough. So all these things brings grievances, and when grievances are not addressed, basically conflicts within states are bound to happen. And every other region of Africa has witnessed these conflicts. If you look at Angola in the 90s, you look at Ivory Coast, all these have witnessed conflicts. But as I explained earlier, the transformation has been now these conflicts are within states, and therefore a proper mechanism within African Union or regional organization should come in to address this conflict. And also there should be mechanisms within state to try and manage this conflict before they blow out. The dream of Pan-Africanism under OAU, I think, was that one was largely advanced by Kwame Nkrumah. But there were two ideas at the time of African states becoming independence. There was the school of thought of Kwame Nkrumah that advocated for an United States of Africa.
basically collapsing the boundaries and dealing with Africa as one state, one united state. But there was another view that eventually prevailed that was saying that unity should be gradual, so that we just get independence, African states to get independence as individual states, and thereafter do what? We'll forge a united front later on. But then again, we realize that when these individual states got independence, they also developed their own classes of bourgeois, classes of leaders that are managing state affairs, and therefore it becomes difficult to think that these leaders can now collapse their authority, to now pledge loyalty to a higher authority somewhere else. Secondly, after independence, of course, in terms of economy, there were different economies, different stages of economic development, different level of economic growth, and therefore those that with larger economies were feeling that it is not proper for us to integrate because these so-called poor countries will cash in to what we have gained. That also translates to issues of natural resources. And therefore, that is the elusive part of integrating Africa, because national interests have superseded continental interest. Now, in relation to the conflict, I think when we say that conflict within states have gone down because there is no active war, but confrontations are there. Of course, now we know there is an issue between Rwanda and Congo. Yet all these two countries are members of East African Community. So you realize that tensions are there. The wars between two states have largely reduced, but tensions are there. What is even worrying is that the tensions are there within states that are in the same regional economic communities. And therefore, something should urgently be done. Of course, there are initiatives that are there to try and negate interstate wars. For example, in the case of East Africa, we have the East African Standby Force that is there to try and manage East Africa. There is issues of IGAD that is trying to manage the Eastern African security architecture. But still, tensions are there. Just the other day, Ethiopia and Eritrea signed a peace agreement, but did not take long. Tensions are there. So even when you argue that interstate wars have gone down, it doesn't mean that now there is peace. We can refer it basically as hot peace. Peace with tensions. So these are the things that need to be managed, and they need to be managed within the broader scope of African unity within the African Union architecture.
Some of the discourse around Pan-Africanism talks of Pan-Africanism within the African continent, which they call particularistic Pan-Africanism. And then there is the comprehensive Pan-Africanism, which incorporates these people that are of African descent who live elsewhere. What do you think, you see the initiative like what is going on in Ghana, which has granted people from the Americas visa-free entry. They are regarded as brothers. So what's going on there? Is that part of what you described earlier on as cultural diplomacy, specific to, you know, black people, to Pan-Africanism, or what's going on there?
Yes, I think Ghana is known to have been welcoming people from the diaspora that have the African descent for a very long time. Being the nurturers of Pan-Africanism, I think they are trying to advance that, to position themselves as a serious world player and also a serious continental player. For me, I'm thinking that Ghana's action basically is to posture it to attract dealing with other African people in the diaspora to advance their interests. Of course, it is a good thing to trace roots, for Africans to trace their roots, but all of us know that these people from diaspora, not all of them came from Ghana. They came from all parts of Africa, and therefore, if we need to really forge issues of Pan-Africanism, then all countries in the African continent should embrace.
Again, following up on that issue of security, to sort of pick your mind around how Africa could could actually become a global power, because right now, if you look at the current geopolitics, you could very easily say that you know, other people can come and walk over us at any time. Yeah, we are not prepared. Our militaries are small and you know and divided, because they are divided across all these African countries. We don't have the equipment. We don't make any equipment. So when we talk about security, is Africa really secure?
We need to look at security in two fronts. One, physical security, and probably economic security. But now, to answer your question directly, is that Africa should take advantage of the new world order, and the new world order is a multipolarity. We've moved away from the unipolar system where one country, and that was that time one state, that time US, was dictating what should happen. We've also moved at a world order where the world was bipolar, that is USSR and America driving the world, so that you are either on the side of USA and the West or the side of USSR. Now we are in a multipolar world. In multipolar world means there are different centers of power that dictate the norms, the values, and how the world should operate. So with this multipolar system, it gives Africa a unique place to posture themselves, to create a center of power as Africa, so that they can now negotiate with the rest of the world. It is just unfortunate that the multipolarity comes whereby African countries are just joining the different factions of centers of power. You can see the BRICS, and now South Africa is part of the BRICS. Ethiopia has a keen eye on it. Of course, these other countries are also aligned to America. An ideal situation would be Africa, through their regional organization, creating a powerhouse, creating a center of power in Africa. When they have a center of power in Africa, then they'll have a proper negotiating platform in terms of their security.
How can they be able to do that? Establish their own center of power?
Through regional organization can establish their center of power. For example, the East African Standby Force. This can be empowered to be a force that secures East Africa. And because it is operating within the regional economic community, therefore it can also secure the economic interest of East Africa. But that can only happen when all the East African countries are on the same page. This is not the case. East African countries have issues within themselves, and it is also replicated in the West. In West Africa, there is the ECOWAS with a security architecture, but still member states within the ECOWAS zones are not ensynced. So firstly is having effective cooperation amongst the regional economic communities, and then with there now planning for proper security framework that secures their interest both on land, at sea, and even within the economic spheres.
How can we build African armies so that they become forces of repute that can actually defend the African continent, that can actually enable the African continent to protect its own interests, because we don't appear to be developing along those lines?
First of all, we need to look at the nature of threat today in Africa. The nature of threat in Africa today, it will be so unlikely that foot soldiers from another continent come to beat up a country, a state in Africa. But it is highly possible to use technological warfare to attack a state in Africa in terms of their system. And therefore, I'm thinking that African security architecture, military, should more think of modernizing their weapons in terms of technological advancement. You can see the nature of war has changed with the example of Russia and Ukraine. It's not the soldiers who often go and to the other side. It is the drones. Drones reach Kiev, the capital. And therefore, given the situation of Africa, of course having the foot soldiers is important, well trained for that matter. But besides that, we really need to invest on issues, technology, issues, modernizing of African military. You realize that most African states don't buy up-to-date equipment. They buy either second generation or third generation. For example, the helicopters that are bought in Kenya military, they are not actually brand new. So first, modernizing the equipments using technology would be more the most appropriate thing to secure African territory. Warfare has gone into digital. So the cyberspace issues, those are the areas that states in Africa need to secure. And having done that, they'll have secured themselves. Of course, more funding for the military is crucial. But for me, I'm thinking technological warfare is what African states should bank on, because that is how war has changed in the world. From the point we got independent, that is the point we started being consumers. And this has not left us. We are a consumer society yesterday, today, and if nothing is changed, even tomorrow. And therefore, even in terms of these equipments, largely we don't have the capacity yet to develop our own capacity, military equipments. Not only military equipment, Africa is struggling with getting basic things right, like value addition of basic goods, so that we don't need to export our tea from Kenya to another country when it is primary material, raw material. We only need to have done value addition and now export it when it's a fine product. But that is not happening. Most African states, they are still in the business of exporting raw materials, then importing the final product. If you're in that stage, then it is even harder to manufacture military equipments. So by and large, if we don't change our style of governance, we will still be a consumer society, and that one can take a toll on us, because with that then we cannot project real development or real industrialization.
What do you think of the idea which is pursued in Africa, whereby African countries are convinced that the best way to secure themselves is to invite other foreign forces to come and set up bases on African soil? So what's going on there? Can't we be secured without inviting foreign armies to come and help us with our security?
I don't think you can be secure by bringing another person to your home when you know very well that you don't know the motives of this person. Remember, global politics is real politics. I come with my interests. I can package that interest in a way that you think I am coming to help you. And that is the case with these military bases dotted across African states. They come with a view that they'll want to give you support. But by and large, they've packaged their own interests, so that even when they have overstayed their welcome, if you tell them they go away, they bring problems, and they want to negotiate for new contracts. That should tell you something, that they are not serving the countries that they are in. For me, I'm thinking that African states should build their own capacity, individual capacities, in terms of their security, because they are the ones who understand the dynamics that they are facing. The military bases are dotted across Africans. In real times, you will not see them in action. It is still these African inadequate security personnel that will get into action. So for me, I'm thinking that the military bases is not a good idea, because they don't serve African state. They don't even make us safe. They've been here long enough, but issues security are still with us. So it's high time, I think, the African leadership should rethink about having military bases within their country.
What makes it so difficult for African countries to speak with one voice, and why is the African Union so dependent on other foreign actors for funding even?
Yes, the African Union, of course, found formally the Organization of African Unity came into force in 2002. But in terms of comparison, people have argued that the OAU, the old one, has really achieved, because one of the key mandate was to liberalize, to make African states independent. There is a serious debate as to whether the AU today is, of course, serving the aspirations of Africa. Of course, cognizant with the fact that in terms of paper or theory, AU has very nice documents. They have an idea of where they want to take Africa. Issues like Vision 2063, African Vision Agenda 2063, those are smart ideas that are seeking to make Africa prosperous, that are seeking to make Africa a middle-income economy, the states in Africa. These are smart ideas. But then again, practical implementation of these ideas. The Union does not have the ability to marshal up individual states to implement these programs. Of course, the old narrative of sovereignty, that I am just willing to cooperate with you so long as my sovereignty is intact. And some of these ideas that are advanced by AU, some borders issue sovereignty, and individual states, member states in Africa, may not be willing to of course, compromise on that. But then again, issues finance. Individual states are grappling with so much in terms of their economies, in terms of the problems that they are facing within themselves, and therefore, in terms of financing AU, sometimes they get incapacitated because there is no enough financing, making now the Union to look for funds outside. And of course, as the saying goes, whoever foots the bill, call the shots. And therefore, if African Union gets funding from outside, then it would be hard for them to say no to the demands of those people. Of course, today, you know, the house, the building that houses African Union in Ethiopia is funded and was built by the Chinese. Don't you think that if the Chinese come calling on African Union for a favor, will they decline? And therefore, the problem of African Union is structural. It is problem within in terms of finances, within in terms of ability to implement their resolution, so that the resolutions that are made are just that, resolutions. In terms of implementing them, countries really can tell them off when they feel that whatever is being implemented is against them. If African Union had real teeth, we should not be talking about conflict in Africa. We should not be talking about issues of Sudan today. We should not be talking about issues of Somali, because there are so many frameworks of managing security, of creating peace, including organs like African Panel of the Wise. These are former influential people and African heads of states and governments to try and ensure that the African continent is peaceful. But these are not happening. Why? Because of lack of practical implementation strategy. And therefore, in terms of theory, so many good documents, progressive documents, but we need now a think tank that can now transform these theoretical ideas into practical implementation. When that is done, then Africa will now emerge not as a consumer of world politics, but as a player of world politics. Today, Africa just consumes whatever is happening. They just align. They don't make things happen.
Will it really work, given the fact that it is subsumed under the world trade or international trade regime, which Africa itself cannot go against, in the case individual African countries have already ratified, for instance, WTO. So will the African Free Trade Area work, or will it just provide a conduit, an easier conduit for international corporations to just bring in their goods here? As you said earlier on, we are not manufacturing.
One of the brilliant ideas that the AU has put in place is the idea of African Free Trade Area. Of course, it is meant to do two things: reduce trade barriers, the many taxes that are imposed on goods from individual African states. For example, goods from West Africa to Kenya, or Kenya to West Africa. There is so much taxes that you'll have to pay. By the time the product reach there, then the value is higher than whatever has come outside Africa. So reduction of taxes, or tariffs for that matter, and non-tariff barriers. If there was a way of reducing them, then there would be free flow of trade within Africa. But there are issues that are affecting implementation of these. Firstly, some of the issues are historical. That Africa does not have proper infrastructure to facilitate mobility. All of us know, of course, that sometimes it is hard to get to West Africa when you're in Kenya, or even to go to North Africa when you're in Kenya. You are forced to get out of the continent and then come back. These are now the structural barriers that also affect trade. And therefore, two things that need to be done. One, because African Free Trade Area is just an expansion of what is envisaged in regional economic organization. Regional economic organizations such as the EAC, East African Community, also have protocols that enhances free mobility within East Africa. Free mobility of goods, free mobility of services, free mobility of labor. That is the same thing that African Free Trade Area seeks to do. And therefore, before we get there, probably these regional organizations, SADC, EAC, East African Community, ECOWAS, ECAS for Central Africa, needs to first make their region effective so that there is free movement in those regions. Somebody can take their goods freely from Ghana to Nigeria to Ivory Coast, or move from Ghana to Nigeria to Ivory Coast. In Kenya, of course, in East Africa, somebody should be able to move freely with their goods from Kenya to Uganda, to South Sudan, or to Rwanda. If that is done, then now the African Continental Free Trade Area will just be something that is a feeder. The regional organization feeds into the African Continental Free Trade Area. But as it is, there are still problems with these regional economic organizations in terms of movement of goods, services, and they basically trade. And therefore, we cannot jump into Africa and imagine that it will be effective when we've not sorted out the mess. The mess is in the regional economic organization. Once we fix that one, and there's free movement of labor, free movement of goods, free movement of services, then it would be easy to realize the African free trade area, because basically it will be a regional organization negotiating with another regional organization.
Let's come to the issue of China. Looks like China is the country that manufactures for us. I can understand why the Americans decided to buy from, to relocate their companies and buy from China, because the argument was China has the cost of labor is low, or was low during the 1990s, into the 2000s, early 2000s. But I would imagine that the cost of production in Africa is even lower, or was even lower. So, but we decided to copy the Americans. So now we get the Chinese to manufacture for us. What is the implications for that, both long-term and short-term, for our economies?
Uniquely, China decided that after being sidelined so much, of course, at some point it was called Red China. All of us know the politics behind that. China decided to focus on their economy, economic diplomacy majorly. They decided we want to engage the world, but we want to engage the world in economic terms. And these economic terms, we will produce and we will take them. And of course, in the street, there is a common saying that whatever you want from China, you will get in terms of quality. Because China gives products to America. They're not complaining about quality. Of course, to Africa, you know the debates around it, the things they give. Of course, Africa, because of the colonial ties, and I don't know if you should say ideological orientation, they have tended to prefer the West long enough, yet the West are not keen to empower African states to be industrialized. And the implication is very simple. Where do the West get their raw material? Developing countries like Africa. Of course, China does the same, getting raw materials there. Raw materials includes our natural resources, oil included. And therefore, by empowering African states to industrialize, where will they get the raw materials? That is the question. And therefore, it is easier to give them aid than to empower African states to get the raw materials. China decided it will come. Of course, it will come with their economic diplomacy model, build infrastructure, but also give you the loan. Give you the loan to build the infrastructure. The difference is that theirs is not so attached into the political ideologies. But basically, the idea of China and the West is the same in terms of how they relate to Africa. It is towards their own benefit and to guarantee that Africa remains a market for their goods. And therefore, it is upon African states to realize that they cannot be consumers forever, as we had mentioned earlier. they need to now start moving towards manufacturing their own things, simple things. You go to the supermarkets in Kenya or other places. I've been to Uganda. You can see even a toothpick written some country, made in a certain country. That tells you that in terms of industrialization, we are not really doing much. And that is where now African states should take up the challenge. No states from outside Africa will come to tell you industrialize. No. Because if they tell you industrialize, they are shooting themselves in the foot. They're saying, if you people industrialize, we lose out on the market. And therefore, it is us to have our way of renaissance, to realize that, hey, we cannot consume for it. Other people should also consume our product. That is the point, that now Africa will change the international political economy of the world.
What prevents Africa from truly rising?
What prevents Africa from truly rising is that Africa has not been able to position itself in the global stage. Africa, even with the resources it has not been able to say, these are the terms of using our resources. It has not been able to say, in terms of world politics, these are the terms. If you cannot operate within our terms, then we know who you are, that you're not our friend. So Africa has largely feed into the terms of other states. That is what makes the aspirations of Africa so hard to realize. Of course, internal problems, that there is no single African voice. We are 55 countries today, 55 states. We cannot claim that we have a single voice. Different regions, different states have different ideas of what they want Africa to be, making even the implementation of AU's aspirations difficult. So first, we need to inculcate an African voice, single African voice. Then, now, that single African voice can help us dictate African terms to the world. If that is not achieved, then, as you're saying, they'll just remain superfluous words in our mouths.
The idea of technological diplomacy, has emerged. What is that, and how can we leverage it as Africans?
Yes, of course, as the world changes, technology is developing, and every other sector tries to incorporate technology to make work easier or to make work efficient. And therefore, as opposed to the old ways of doing diplomacy, you realize where there used to be embassies, of course embassies are still there, and people sitting on round table, the diplomatic environment has changed. And not only changed, has also expanded, so that through Twitter, president can communicate diplomatic position to the world. Of course, through the digital space, a lot of diplomacy goes there. The people have now been incorporated into issues diplomacy, and they can really make noise or take a certain position. And therefore, basically, technology has filtered into the diplomatic circle, so that diplomats use technology to advance the interest of their states. This can be economic interest, can be cultural diplomacy, of course, with a view of projecting or taking advantage of the digital space to leverage their interest. This is the new frontier in the diplomatic circle. Of course, with the introduction of AI also, these are areas that if states have not taken a keen interest to invest in, then they'll lose a lot. And there, in that perspective, I urge African states to really be keen on embracing or modernizing their diplomatic practice in terms of using the digital space.
You remember how COVID exposed Africa's underbelly? We realized that we don't have the capacity to produce medications and vaccines, but I think that is on the better side. The worst case scenario is what is being referred to as Trojan labs. You saw what happened in the case of Wuhan lab. The kind of experiments that were being done there were, very risky experiments. And if I recall very carefully, they were working on what they have been referring as basically gain of function research. Essentially development of warfare, or chemical warfare. But you see, the main sponsor of those kinds of experiments was not even China. But China saw that as an opportunity for some technology to be transferred without knowing that if you accepted that, then it means you are exposing your people to very dangerous pathogens which could be released, So coming to Africa, in all our medical research facilities are controlled by those foreign entities. Because as you said earlier on, he who pays the piper calls the tune. So do you think that we could, the funding we get establishes or could end up establishing what could turn out to be very dangerous laboratories in Africa, and thereby affecting our health security?
Health security or health diplomacy is a very emerging field that African states need to really be keen on. Of course, the lessons learned from the COVID experience, for some reason it went the way it did in African states, that not so many people lost their life. That is a good thing. But assuming it was happening the way we were seeing on televisions, what was happening in Europe, the number of deaths, then Africa would be worse off. And the politics thereafter, after the vaccine was gotten, Africa was begging for the vaccines. That should have told African states something. That health, a very crucial thing, should not be left to outsiders to control. Just the way getting vaccines was difficult because it was funded by other people, is the same way it is dangerous to allow other people control health in Africa in terms of the laboratories. Because as you're saying, something can be developed very easily that is even non-related to health to turn out into a biological weapon. And when they do that, of course, it is still the Africans whom experiments are done on them. And therefore, the issue of health is so crucial and so central to state control that states should not allow other places to, or other states to control them remotely, control the library remotely. Of course, we know there are issues of funding of these laboratories. African states are competing with so many things, so that funding issues like laboratories or research centers cannot be part of the top priorities. However, with effective governance, I believe the monies that are getting wasted in corruption or excesses of government, those monies can be rechanneled to secure the health sector. Because it appears that pandemics now are becoming more are likely to become more frequent than anticipated. Earlier on, it would argue that it is after every 100 years a major pandemic, but you just realize we had COVID the other day. Now people are talking about other diseases that are coming up and could be very catastrophic to the population, and therefore this should be a awakening call to governments that issues laboratory, issues medical research centers should be a preserve of the state, and it should be largely securitized so that health become a security issue, of course within the framework of human security, to guarantee safetiness of the population or citizenry within Africa, and basically to also guarantee the safetiness of the state.
Let me ask you a question about the United Nations and particularly the UN Security Council, which appears to be skewed or even anti-Africa in the way in which it is organized, the architecture of it. Only 5 countries with veto power, permanent members. So yet, if you look at the total composition of the membership of the United Nations, the majority are African states, yet they have no voice. So what is your take on that?
For me, the United Nations still lives in the old world order. It has not reformed to align to the new world order. The new world order has different centers of power, and Africa is just one of those that needs to be taken seriously. You realize by the time African Union was being formed, we could not be talking about sovereign African states. 1945, no African state was already sovereign, and therefore it has continued like that. The African Union, the United Nations has continued up to today. Yet, so many changes have occurred in the world. But in terms of the Security Council, it has not responded to these changes. And there is a major debate within African states to be incorporated into the Security Council. It doesn't make sense that most of the issues discussed in Security Council affect Africa directly in a larger percentage. And generally, most issues that are decisions made, resolutions made by the African Union, in a larger percent, they affect Africa. And therefore, Africa should be given a voice at the Security Council. There is a debate as to the nature of the nature of membership that Africa requires in the Security Council. Of course, African states had proposed for 2 members in the Security Council with veto powers. And that was embraced by the permanent members. The only difference is that they want 2 states from Africa to join the expanded Security Council, but the trick is these 2 states would not have veto powers, making them just members of the club, but without powers. But for me, I'm thinking the direction that African states have taken is the right one. They continue pushing because, as they said, there is nothing about us without us. So you cannot be discussing issues Africa and the African voice that we've been talking about is not on the table with the other people. So Africa is really fronting for permanent membership in the Security Council with veto powers, and they should even be louder in that to help reform the United Nations, because I think the United Nations today is ripe for institutional reforms so that it aligns to the modern realities. It seems to be lacking or lagging behind in the modern realities, and probably that is why conflicts are still raging on in different parts of the countries. Probably its reformation would align to modern realities. We had earlier said modern reality includes war shifting from 2 states to wars within states. These are the realities that it should be able to interrogate. So majorly, Africans should really continue pushing, beat their drums louder for reforms within the United Nations. Of course, after the slots are given, we can come back to Africa and do the African politics, because that is another huge debate, that if the slots are given, who becomes? That will be something else. But currently, as they are continuing, let them continue pushing. Let them continue having that conversation to have the 2 slots with veto power. The Africa that we want today is an Africa that can stand on its 2 feet. One of the things that still incapacitate us is the question of foreign debt. The burden of debt in African states makes them basically not be able to engage in the world constructively. So that every other time African states want to project their voice properly, they'll be reminded about, hey, come slowly, because you remember you have our debt. So the question of debt is a very thorny one, and is one of the issues that is hampering African states' progress. And therefore, the architect within African Union should be thinking about how to negotiate for either reorganization or a suspension of these African debts. African states should not be left alone to battle with their debt. These are the issues that should be taken within the frameworks of AU. Of course, we've seen other countries outside Africa forgiving debt for some selected African states. This is an indicator that this can happen, and therefore the question of debt should be brought on the table to ensure that it is seized off within the frameworks of AU and projected as one common issue that needs to be addressed. Of course, with that, other areas that needs to be focused on within African states is we need to really calcate or bank into our culture. We project our cultural diplomacy. Africans population have very rich, unique cultures that if they are tailored well, they can really be used within foreign policy circles to attract businesses, to attract investment within individual states. So moving forward, of course, today the African Union is 22 years old. In an African setup, a child who is 22 years old is a person who should be is an adult and should be either out there living alone. And therefore, if Africa today is 22 years old, the OAU, we are forgetting about now the other one, the OAU, because Africa today, since independent, we are about 60 years old. Countries that are 60 years since independence should now have been able to stand with their feet. But in terms of AU, 22 years old, I think it should do better. Should do better in terms of negotiating for Africa outside the world, should do better in terms of managing internal African problems.